Hello, and welcome to the How I Tested That podcast. I'm your host, David J. Bland. I'm an author and advisor, and I'm fascinated with testing early-stage ideas. I've helped companies all around the world, and in this podcast, I connect with entrepreneurs and innovators who had the courage to test their ideas with real people in the market, with sometimes surprising results. Please join us as we explore the ups and downs of experimentation together. Today's guest is Amer Abu Khajil, the founder of Perceptional. Perceptional uses AI to conduct hundreds of conversations with your users to quickly turn insights into decisions. Amer and I spoke about his journey from civil engineering to product at Amazon to startup founder, and the similarities between his different roles over the years. He is passionate about using AI to automate parts of the discovery process and produce better evidence in decision making. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Amer.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, David.
I'm so excited to have you on because I became aware of Perceptional like several months ago, and it really piqued my interest because I'm really into discovery work and how to augment that using AI and everything. But I would love for you to share some stories about sort of what led up to that idea and kind of some of your background to our listeners.
For sure. Yeah, no, happy to share. Thanks for having me on. I've listened to a few episodes. I really love this topic about testing things, and it's obviously related to some of the stuff I do myself. So very glad to be on the podcast. So yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I could talk a little bit about myself and kind of my background. So my background's actually in civil engineering. And then I've kind of pivoted into the technology and product world after doing an MBA. I kind of still tell people, I guess, that I used to build buildings and now I build products and kind of, making those sound like the same thing. And they actually are surprisingly very similar. And so, yeah, that's kind of how my journey really started early on. But yeah, after going to business schools, doing an MBA here at the University of British Columbia, I kind of landed into the world of technology, let's call it broadly. So I had some interesting roles. I've always been involved in entrepreneurship, intrapreneurship, innovation in a few different ways. One of the first things I did was working as the director of product and innovation at a local software development agency called TTT Studios. And there I was lucky enough to have a role where essentially I got to build startups within that company. And essentially, I had the opportunity to launch 2 startups there from, idea, prototyping, validation, obviously, launch and some early revenue and traction. And also got to create, and I think really the thing that got me, started in this world and, diving deeper into this world is actually creating a new product development process for that company and kind of really got me to think about, what is an idea? How do we validate an idea? How do we, not just myself, but potentially as a team or as a company decide, where do we spend our time and money and effort to? And so that was a very formative work experience as part of my career journey. I then had spent some time at Amazon as a product manager in the global store division there. So again, got to learn a lot about, how a big company works, how to really influence people, get your ideas through, just even prioritize them inside your team, but also, within a bigger organization. And again, I got to work on some both like new and existing features during my time there. And then that kind of, after leaving Amazon, led me to Perceptional. I could talk a bit more about the genesis of that and how it came. It actually was not the first thing I was planning to work on when I left Amazon. And if anything, my time and experience in kind of working on validating things is what ended up leading me to Perceptional.
It's such an interesting journey. And I'm always curious when I talk to people who they feel like they have these really big pivots in their career, but there's this underlying sort of foundation or commonality. So I've met people that did urban planning and then they went into business consulting, but it was sort of like the flow was the commonality there. So maybe you could explain or dive into a bit about sort of that underlying connection, because you mentioned when I pivoted, it's still kind of similar building products to building. So maybe you can elaborate a bit on that.
Honestly, it is so similar that it's like, I feel like every civil engineer, or I don't know if it's maybe engineering in general, needs to graduate with a PM certificate as well. Because ultimately, fundamentally, you're getting to an endpoint, right? For civil engineering, we're always working towards delivering our project, which is ultimately a physical building. But in order to do that, there's all these different stages where we are doing, working with an architect to plan our initial designs, the structural engineering designs. Then, once we have alignment with our client, going out and actually doing more robust designs. Once you have that, you're kind of creating specs for the manufacturers if they're creating a steel structure or a prefabricated concrete structure. And then you're reviewing those. And then, you're on site seeing how things get built. and ultimately getting that final product, which is a building. And I got to do some cool projects at the YVR airport here. So to this day when I go to travel, I see some of the work I did. And so very proud of that work. But yeah, it's so similar to product management and a startup. I'd say definitely closer to product management. There's definitely aspects of it like a startup, but it truly is like, you're managing a project, you're managing stakeholders. On one side, it was obviously the client and architects. And on this other side, it is, again, you're often your customers, your development team, your designers. So I'd say designers and architects, there's a lot of parallels there. And you're going through these different stages, right? Like, in civil engineering, you're reviewing specs and designs and things like that. You're doing the same thing as a product manager or a startup founder. And then ultimately, again, getting to that endpoint. Probably the biggest difference is that, like, especially within the startup world, you're there to, like, let's say maintain things and obviously have them evolve over time. Whereas with buildings, it's a little bit more final. I guess you can go in every decade or something to make some tweaks and updates to your building. But in general, once you deliver a building, it kind of is what it is. But yeah, no, it's very similar. A lot of project management, a lot of stakeholder kind of management, prioritization, and just technical design as well, right? Like a lot of that spending time at your desk, planning, what you're going to build and what you're going to design and how it's going to work and look and feel.
Yeah, I just flew out of that airport a couple weeks ago. So now you got me interested. Cool. I'm like, did I see any of your work there?
A couple things, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about, not to belabor the point and talk too much about the parallels here, but it's very interesting to me that you see that connection and the similarities. And I'm thinking, how do you test as a civil engineer? Like, how do you start testing without investing a lot there? And did any of that help inform your work in tech?
100%. So I think the biggest thing I learned back then is anything you do for your work is you're giving options or optionality. Like that was one thing that my manager at the time drilled into me when we were doing the work in civil engineering. And that really translates very much to the startup's validation product where, you don't just say like, okay, here's a problem that we want to solve. Here's the solution. You're like, oh, here's a couple of solutions. Here's a couple of ways I could look into this. And then I go and test those out. And so, some of the examples there, my civil engineering career is that as a company, like, so when we would work, let's say with the airport, they would do a lot of early stage studies because they're not going to invest a lot of money into things before they know how much they cost. And so they start off by saying, okay, well, we want to build, a parkade. To even get a good estimate of what this is going to cost, we need to see options on like what kind of structure, what kind of material we're going to build it with. What's the dimension, like the ideal dimension of every section of that parkade. And so like, I still remember, going and making, like 5, 6, even I think in some cases like 10 different potential alternatives, whether it's like changing materials or changing the dimensions. And then kind of bringing them back to my manager, figuring out how we can best summarize them, present them to our client, and then ultimately take that back to like the architects and the client to see like, how do we move forward with this and get better estimates. And that was a project that, funny enough, like we did work on the early stages of the parkade for YVR. And that was a project where our company ended up doing the study portion. So like kind of the analysis, but then didn't end up getting the work for the final project. They did get some other big work at the airport, but it wasn't that specific project. But yeah, it did involve a lot of that. Like I'd say like the big thing there is really the options, like really understanding that, there's not always a definitive answer for anything. You're kind of trying to create and look at things from different angles to come up with different options. And I think for me, that's a big part of like my, when I think about validating a solution, just not coming at it with like one set idea.
Yeah, I like that. So you take what you've learned as a civil engineer and use that in tech. And then you mentioned TTT and you're finding your own sort of process there. Can you elaborate a little bit on how you think through this process or your experiences there and how that maybe was informing where you've taken it now?
For sure. Yeah. So my time at TTT was super interesting because, when I got in, the team had already had an initial prototype for one of the ideas. And so really the first kind of year I was there, we actually were only working on the one concept, which was a facial recognition check-in solution for events and conferences. So that one I got to kind of see from early prototype through like, essentially validating the use case because there was a few different use cases we could do to launch. And so really the process came after that. And so in a sense, what I was able to do is almost dissect what worked in our launch for that concept because that concept was successful to really figure, okay, like if we want to replicate that kind of success, what can we do? What can we do to make the process better, faster, and so on? And so a big part of it obviously was, spending time on the ideation stage and because that like figuring out what did we even want to look into. But once we did, I guess the biggest thing there was kind of trying to separate and something I'll maybe talk about a few different points in this podcast, like separating validation into just problem validation and solution validation. Because often like those get so mixed up, especially, less so I'd say in professional settings like a company or within a product management role or a UX researcher role. But in startups, founders tend to put just validation in a general bucket. And really, I think the process for us at TT that I created there was saying, okay, like what are ideas, even if we have solutions, but like let's distill them to their core problem. Go out and talk to people just about that problem, understand if that problem actually exists. And then once we feel confident, that that's the case, we can go and again, create some options for the solution and go then validate those solutions. And so that was really a key part of the process. And then obviously we would go into like, okay, how do we then maybe once we get there, do some more prototyping, validate at that stage as well before going out to build. And then, a big part of the process there for us, because it was, let's say, this kind of innovation hub within a company, was thinking about, like, how do we align as a team at every stage, right? So kind of bringing back the results of every stage to the leadership team and to be like, all right, here's where we're at. What are we thinking? So there's kind of these check-in, and I think I called them gates. I still sometimes use that term of like, there's these different multiple gates as you go through the process where we're not going to take anything for granted. We're going to try to pause and like question ourselves based on those gates. And in that case, actually, like one framework I used there, I'm not sure if I'm going to get the name right, but I think it literally just called like the venture capital assessment framework. So like a big part of it was how VCs assess ideas. And, I think that's a framework, I had a spreadsheet of it from business school. So again, we took that, adapted it to how would you assess a startup idea based on that framework for that gate.
Yeah, that's very similar to how I approach things as well. I think it's smart, right? To really deeply understand the problem before you jump to the solution. Otherwise, you have a solution, you're kind of seeking a problem, right? And you have a runway and either find it or not. Quite often when you think about those interviews, one of the misconceptions I find with my teams is surveys and interviews, I think, are a great place to start most of the time. But I think sometimes I hear this, when we say validation, I hear, well, we talked to a customer, we validated that. And I'm like, did you really validate? We have some directional evidence that it exists. Yeah. And I think we might need to hover there. And so I do think speed is always a challenge because you're trying to balance speed and also the amount of confidence you have and evidence you have. But I think the way you framed it, this idea of, do we deeply understand the problem, then let's move on to potential solutions, not a solution. And I think that's a very smart way to approach it. But what tips or techniques do you recommend for maybe not getting too excited when you hear what you want to hear just from one interview to jump ahead? What helped you sort of maybe slow down to speed up there?
I think a big thing is kind of planning out your what is validated before you go into these things, right? So for us, again, having that process created and then, doing the stuff later on really made me think about, before I go do interviews, what am I going to consider to be validation, right? Because interviews are naturally qualitative. And so it's very difficult to say you talk to one person, you get excited and that's it. And trust me, I've talked to people and like sometimes the most excited person is the person that will ghost you later on when you launch your product. And so it means absolutely nothing that someone's excited about your idea. And so for me, a big part of it was prior to going into, let's say problem validation interviews, I'm taking obviously so obviously we're not going to get too much into the weeds, but, I have a hypothesis. I create questions that will help me validate or invalidate each hypothesis. So every question in my interview or conversation ties back to a hypothesis that I have. And then I'll try to, again, create like a feeler, some kind of metric. Because again, a lot of this is qualitative. And so I think I've done ones where it's like, kind of someone who's the most on board would be like a champion. Someone who is, kind of in the middle or just below the middle is like a skeptic. And so I can't remember the exact levels, but I kind of created like 5, it's almost a scale from 1 to 5 for each kind of response. And then I kind of gave them these words that really would trigger where, if someone I spoke with was on board, I'd be like, okay, this person is aligned. This person is a champion. This person is a skeptic. And then after each interview, I'm not only just thinking about how I felt after the interview, I'm kind of going through the transcript. And it's not really a transcript. I'm often just taking notes during these interviews and almost trying to rank per question and based on their response or, per answer, I guess, where do they rank, from 1 to 5 on that scale? And then I look at, okay, well, that question was tied to a hypothesis. So for that person, for hypothesis 1, 2, 3, how do I feel? Did they validate it, invalidate it, or is it inconclusive? That's for one interview. But then obviously before I go into all this, I have a target to say I want 2/3 of the interviews to validate my hypothesis or something along those lines. And again, that level of validation, so what is validation? The way I like to describe it is it is depending on you as a founder or as a product manager, let's say, and your risk tolerance. So if you're very risk taking, you could say, I'm happy with a 50-50 hit rate. If half the people I talk to are on board, that's great. half or not, I'm okay with that. But if you're, risk averse, you might say, you know what, I really need like 8 or 9 out of 10 people to be on board with this to help me validate that hypothesis for me to move on. That's really how I kind of created, my own process. But it really is just being that granular with every step. And like I said, I think the biggest thing is creating your scorecard, let's call it, before you start the whole process.
Yeah, I think it's smart to tie it back to a hypothesis. I mean, that's what I recommend as well. We do something like assumptions mapping, and then we get the most important assumptions with least amount of evidence, and those usually involve the customer early on. So getting those and then saying, okay, we're going to go off and test to see if we can get evidence to support or refute that. And we're going to need a script. We don't have to read from it, but we should actually think through what we're trying to learn. It's not just hanging out with people and talking, which I think sometimes customer interviews end up being, unfortunately. And that doesn't really help you come back and say, wait, what did we learn from that? Did that support or refute? And even if it's directional early on, you don't have to have 100% confidence, but you do need to tie it back. So I love that you're tying it back to a hypothesis.
Just a quick comment on that too, especially with problem validation, because problem validation often, with solution validation, you might be coming with like Figma designs or a prototype or something to like get feedback on. But I find with problem validation, it's often like you're asking them about like what they do in their job, like how much time do they spend on certain tasks, and so those conversations sometimes go off the rails. And so really being clear with like what questions you have, maybe prioritizing your questions often, like before I go into these calls, I'm thinking, okay, like, these are the must ask questions. And these are kind of like, okay, the nice to have follow-ups is really important when you're testing that, like at that problem stage.
Agreed. And then I like what you said about having them talk about the past and not just future hypothetical situations.
100%.
So how much they've spent trying to solve this problem, or did they solve it or not, or what other things did they hire to do this, from like a jobs to be done perspective. But I was thinking through sort of like, are these champions or not? And one sort of maybe anecdotal story I heard once, we were working in this lab out of San Francisco, and someone said, it's like Vaders, Wookiees, and C-3POs. So like Vaders are not going to be your customer, and they're going to be very skeptical, and no amount of convincing is probably going to tip them over. Whereas Wookiees, they're kind of like in the middle, and they're kind of stubborn, and eventually they might come over, but you have to do some convincing and nurturing over time. And then the C-3POs are like, they just convert super easy, and they get really excited. But then again, you have to nurture that, because later they might not show up at all.
For sure.
So that story always stuck in my head of, okay, yeah, is it a Vader or a Wookiee or a C-3PO? But I like that because you end up with so many different subsegments and anti-segments sometimes that it's hard to like put them all together into one, let's say, persona or value prop canvas or empathy map or whatever tools you're using. And so I love that you are very methodical about it, and you're really trying to find out like how to fine tune your solution or your value prop to the potential segments. And that happens quite honestly a lot when we go off and do these interviews. We think, we have a target segment. We're going to interview like 15 or 20 people that segment. And then you realize, actually half of those were sort of this other segment. And then you have to be careful because you have to apply some visual management to that and some like process to that, or it could get really confusing in your head sometimes.
100%. Yeah, I think for me, like spreadsheets, I document way too much for, especially like solo founder often. Like I need to write things down and have them organized in spreadsheets to like organize my thoughts. Otherwise, it gets really messy. So yeah, that's I think my go-to thing, and it may be a bit of a superpower. Like I'm one of those people that loves documentation. So. But you know what? Something I will say there too, it's like it's easy to just kind of get stuck in the process. And so, definitely I think a key thing here is like each person is different. And so like kind of use the system. I like to kind of encourage people is like have a system and use the one that's going to make you take action, right? Because again, I think a lot of people will come talk to me and like it's something might, certain things I say might feel like pretty complicated to them or like, just too tedious. I'm like, all right, like what can you do? What can you do to feel more confident? Because again, ultimately validation and validating something doesn't mean you're going to be successful. Again, it's just the way I describe it, it's an act or exercise in de-risking moving forward. And so, okay, like, if someone, it's a complicated thing for them, the whole process and all that kind of stuff. Not everyone's like a UX expert or UX researcher. And so like we say, okay, like what can you do? Like, what do you think you can do and achieve and accomplish to feel more confident in moving to kind of this next stage to start? And I think that's fine. You need to start somewhere. And that's kind of really what we've encouraged some of the founders that I've worked with to do is just like really think about how do you break it down into little pieces.
I like it. I like breaking it down in smaller chunks that you can attack. So it sounds like TTT was very influential in your thinking, or maybe you started to codify your process a bit after that. So let's fast forward a little bit to Perceptional. And so where did the idea of Perceptional come from? Was it some of your TTT experience? Help us understand sort of the beginning of Perceptional and maybe explain a bit what you're doing there as far as testing goes.
For sure, yeah. So Perceptional kind of wasn't the first idea I had when I left Amazon. So when I left Amazon at the time, I kind of left being like, okay, you know what? I've done startups before. The big corporate might not be the best fit for me at that point in my career. So I was like, you know what? I kind of want to go back into the startup world. And this time around, try to do something on my own. Because obviously with TTT, I did, these startup ideas within a company again. And I was like, maybe I want to give it a go on my own. And so I left with a huge backlog of ideas that I had kind of accumulated over the years. And, kind of adapted the process I created at TTT to start really thinking about, well, how do I go about validating ideas to meet my own threshold of acceptability, like where I can feel confident moving forward with one of these ideas. And so, yeah, I really just started working through 3 or 4 concepts across e-commerce, climate, I'm trying to think what was the other one, event technology. So it was kind of stuff that I've either been interested in or, played with in the past, in the product or learned about it in my past work. And I had a couple ideas in those spaces and went through what I described earlier, right? So I kind of created, okay, well, what's my hypothesis? I've maybe seen some industry reports that say this is a problem. Let me go validate them. And again, I went through that validation process I was describing earlier. But then, I started realizing I'm using AI in these different points in time because a lot of the open AIs, it didn't exist when I was at TTT at all and really kind of came up over the time I was at Amazon. At the time, I actually at TTT, I do think the GPT 3.5 was kind of starting to creep up. We're starting to see the earliest products were using GPTs, but ChatGPT itself didn't exist. And so anyway, so as I was validating those different ideas, I was looking at where am I using AI in my own workflow? And for me, it was, just again, different places. It was a little bit for generating questions. It was a little bit summarizing some of, synthesizing some of the feedback from the interviews that I was doing. And yeah, really, as I was kind of doing some of that stuff, I was like, okay, well, where can I use it where it's not just as easy as copy pasting into ChatGPT and just build another ChatGPT wrapper? Where can I implement it somewhere that is a bit more bold and maybe a bit more risky and not going to be palatable for everyone, but like a place that would be kind of an interesting challenge. Because again, I did want to take a risk with this next idea or concept. And that's really where the genesis of Perception was. I was like, well, why don't I try to use AI to automate the middle part, which is the conducting of the interview. And the way, I was thinking about it is, let's see how close to a person, this, a human interviewer it could be, knowing it's not really going to be there anytime soon. But, the hypothesis, I guess, for me there was we can use some of the foundational technology to make something that's better than a survey. And that's really how it started is I looked at, the work I did that summer, reflected on, I've had that problem before, at TT, even at Amazon where we've talked to customers and things like that. And I thought, okay, well, why not try to take a chunk out of the middle part? Knowing, again, we're not going to replace human interviews. That's not really the plan anytime soon. But can we create something that's better than a survey? And yeah, that's how Perceptional came to be.
I love that story, born out of a need. I love how you applied your own process. I think sometimes we talk about processes, but we don't apply it to our own stuff. And that's very humbling most of the time. You're like, ooh, maybe that wasn't such a great idea after I tested it a little bit and tried to validate it. So you said something really interesting there with regards to almost like augmenting or automating some of the middle part. So maybe you can get into a little bit of detail about what that means and what that entails and how something like Perceptional assists you and how it's better than a survey.
For sure, yeah. So, and yeah, remind me, we can also touch a bit more as well on how we tested Perceptional because the story there is pretty funny as well. But yeah, the way, it currently operates is, as a product manager, startup founder, market researcher, those are, I'd say, our main 3 customer segments that use Perceptional today. They come into our platform, they're able to create essentially a chatbot. And the way we describe it is you're creating a chatbot that's good at asking questions, not just answering them. And, you provide some context about your product, product or service. So that's just a kind of a description, product name, the objective of that study, and, the series of questions that you want to ask or that you want answered. So again, very similar to setting up a survey, but again, you're providing it with that extra context of what's the overall objective and a little bit more context about the product. So the chatbot that you launch has that context. And yeah, we essentially create a chatbot instance for you, and then you send that link to whoever you want to respond to your survey. And so, yeah, the customer, the respondent gets this. Once they, put in their email or name or, depending on what demographic information you want to collect up front, they just start having a conversation with the chatbot. The chatbot asks questions. So if the way I describe it is if the respondent is doing what they need to do, it actually isn't different from a survey. So think about some surveys where you have respondents that are amazing. They fill out every text box. They're, describing everything really clearly. We actually don't add any value there. I'll say that. But for, the big percentage, that we see in a lot of surveys where people are just putting in one-word answers, that kind of stuff, that's really where we shine. And so if anyone's being very vague, if anyone's providing very short responses, the chatbot kind of tries to nudge them towards providing a more, elaborate answer or more extended answer. And so, it's just asking things like, can you elaborate more on this? Can you provide an example of this? So really trying to take characteristics that we often associate with a human interviewer and pull them into this chatbot experience. And so that's really kind of that middle part that, we focused on, fine-tuning our AI model to do. Yeah, and a key piece there as well has been to make sure that at the end of the day, we also are able to analyze all those transcripts. So once you have all those transcripts, you might have, 10, 20, 30, 40. There you have the full transcripts. Now, how do you summarize them? How do you summarize each one? How do you summarize them all in aggregate as well?
Okay. So like any good interviewer, you would dive deeper. If you had a one-word response to one of your questions, it's like, oh, could you explain a little bit more what you mean by that and everything? So it sounds like you're trying to take that and put that into this sort of more automated experience. So I do like that.
And one thing I'll touch on here as well is on the product itself, because so that was obviously before we built it, that was the assumption. And we just did some quick testing and things like that of the chatbot experience. But we were able to A/B test after we launched. And, we did some of our own studies where we gave the same questions in a survey format and a chatbot format and saw how much information came back. So we've done these studies where we saw that with Perceptional, we got 4 to 5 times more qualitative responses. So literally more text, so either more characters or more words than the same questions being asked in a survey.
Okay, I like that. So coming back, maybe stepping back a bit, what you mentioned before about how you tested, maybe can you share a little bit about how you tested the idea of Perceptional? What were some quick scrappy tests where you were saying, what's our hypothesis and let's go test that? Maybe shed some light on how that came to be.
For sure, yeah. And so it was funny to test because, I was creating a tool where I was trying to say, I want to create a tool that will automate the thing I'm doing right now, help me automate that process. And so it was always a little bit meta, try to describe it to people. But yeah, I went really through the process I described earlier. Just started off with the problem. So, having been a product manager, reached out to fellow product managers that I knew and I didn't know, interviewed them about their workflow, got to talk to some UX folks as well because they're often also involved in that process. And yeah, really went through tell me about your process. How do you collect information today from your customers? If it's qualitative, how do you collect it? Is it, surveys, interviews? So really kind of tried to understand how they currently do things today. And then what their biggest pain points or time sinks were. And, that involved things like, scheduling meetings, rescheduling meetings, a lot of user interviews or customer interviews. You're not really the priority, so a lot of those tend to get rescheduled and shifted around. We heard the same problems with surveys that are very common, which is, people maybe start and don't complete it, so we don't have the data, or people aren't really providing enough feedback or context. Yeah, and so that was, something that we kind of saw come up. And then after that, once I felt confident that this is a problem that I wanted to dive deeper into, really created a pretty lightweight chatbot experience. So using kind of the OpenAI playground. I also had some initial Figma designs. And really in those solution interviews, I was able to show the Figma designs and that a chatbot experience to people. And people got to even play around with it a little bit. And actually that helped even almost get us through some of our early product development, thinking about what are the edge cases? When people see a chatbot, what are they likely to type in and how do they want to trick it? What's their instinct to trick it? And that really became our kind of, early validation as well.
Did you notice any difference between, you said Figma as sort of a prototype and something more interactive? What kind of difference do you notice when you're testing with people and talking to people from a passive experience where they're looking at something versus interacting with something? Maybe share some of your insights there.
Yeah, I think it's I think obviously the more real the thing is, the better. And so that's really when you get the more realistic feedback, I find. So, because a lot of the times things are going to be pretty conceptual when you're validating a solution. Might be pretty like I would say like generic. When you're doing some of this validation, and so like Figma designs are great. I mean, even in Figma, you can do prototypes where you still walk them through a whole process flow. But anytime that you can kind of come to a higher fidelity, it's really gonna be like gonna help and add a bit more value, I think, and really kind of make things sound a bit more realistic and be a bit more realistic. And so, for us, it was that prototype. But, I could have even gone, further step where I even did like I don't know if you even call it an MVP, but like a even lightweight kind of MVP where we go out and validate that as well. But for me, it was really combining that Figma with it really was just a basic, like kind of very basic, like one pager chatbot that was kind of hard coded in a sense. And that's really what we were, validating and testing out within those interviews.
Okay. And so you get more confidence, you're on the right track by how people respond to those. And then you move on to closer to where you're at with now with Perceptional. What are some of the big things you're trying to test now, if you can share them? What are some of the big hypotheses you have now with fast forwarding to today with Perceptional?
For sure, yeah. Yeah, so I think for me, it's just been about how to make the product better, right? The product's out there. We've had customers. I think so many things, actually. I mean, it's a ton. So everything from the business model I've been questioning to how people sign up to how do we make the product, functionality better. So I think for me, like one big learning so far has been I'm still doing a lot of hand-holding with our customers. So even though it's a SaaS product, because I think it's in the user research or product research space, people are still kind of wanting to have someone walk them through of like, well, what are the best questions to ask? Like, how should I be using this? What should this replace? Or, like try to help them kind of fit it into their workflow. And that really what that has looked like is for a few companies, like I'm helping them almost do like their, working with them, with the founder, with the researcher to kind of create that first draft of their research plan to be like, all right, well, this is how you put Perceptional in your research methodology. That's really how it's looked. So essentially working on something like that. But really now for me, it's been thinking about, well, how do I create things in the product that help you do that? And so, I haven't really implemented these, but that's included everything from helping you generate your questions, for example, or a draft of your questions based on your objective, or maybe based on uploading, the work you've done so far. If you have a research plan to help you like understand what kind of questions you want to ask. So that's definitely like one thing to think about. And then also just thinking about, so that's I'd say like one area. I'd say the other area where I comment on the business model is like a lot of individuals, even I'd say small, medium companies sometimes don't have ongoing research needs every single month. And so because we're all like a monthly subscription based solution, we're finding sometimes people will join for a month or two and then kind of churn, and sometimes they'll come back months later, but the business model currently isn't conducive to kind of that long-term customer that you can easily nurture. And so playing around right now with potentially some type of like usage-based or, freemium usage-based model. And then, don't even get me started on the features because, there's still so much stuff to build. We're still a pretty new company. And so, really looking at understanding how we would go about testing things like an audio mode or, testing if you want to test UIs within our platform, how we do go about doing that. And all that would go through kind of a similar problem. I'd say on the problem validation side, like everything I just mentioned, I feel confident is a problem because people have told us in one way or another through the product feedback, whether it's like through emails or follow-ups that we've done with them, that those are things they'd like to see. And so I think for the next step is validating, okay, what option, right? Kind of going back to the beginning of our conversation is like, if we already create a solution for this, how would that solution even look like? And if people are aligned that it is the right way to do it, then we would go out and build it that way. But so many, I think with any startup founder, there is a plethora of things out there to improve. And it's really about like prioritizing them and understanding where do they add value? Do they add value to the business? Do they add value more just to the customer? And like maybe that has some ultimately benefit to the business. And there's no shortage of experiments to run there. Yeah,
it sounds as startups don't really starve. It's almost like you drown in a way. Like there's so many things to do and so many possibilities. I think one of the ways we frame it is desirable, viable, feasible, right? So a lot of desirability is value prop in the customer. Viability is a lot about the cost and revenue, and feasibility is like your backstage, like execution, obviously your team and all that. So it feels as if, you do have some validation on the desirability side, and viability you're kind of finding your way with. And of course you could spend more time making it look better and perform better, but is that the most important work to be done? That's always that trade-off as a founder that's really, really difficult to do. But it sounds like people really value your sort of human touch, or at least your deep domain expertise in this process. And maybe there's some productization of your brain there that goes into the product. I'm wondering if it's just people feel more comfortable with a human being involved, regardless if they're automating things.
100%. I think there's something there as well. I mean, it's interesting to see, like, one thing again where we could do some further testing is like the people who are actually completing the perceptional interviews, what their experience is like. And so maybe it is just about getting feedback from that cohort as well. But for our customers, they want to automate something, but they kind of want to make sure they do it the right way, is my sense. And like I said, at the beginning, like from day one, I knew that we were taking one of the riskier parts of user research, right? Like this is a pretty sacred part. And that's again why I tell people, like, do not assume that this is going to replace, you should still go out and do interviews. Really, this is right now somewhere in the middle. Probably for most companies, this is going to be a closer fit to replacing your survey, qualitative survey, to get like richer feedback that way. Maybe to get you to do fewer, user interviews one-on-one, if you feel confident from the responses you're getting in Perceptional. And so, yeah, like I'm very wary of automation. And like, as you can tell in some of the stuff I described, like, for some of it, I'm still out there talking to people, even though I have a product that's supposed to do that, right? I still go out to talk to people and I use our product for the more basic stuff. So for feedback, customer feedback, feature ideas, that kind of stuff. But if I'm going to go validate solutions, I'm going to go out and talk to people. And so it really is about understanding, when to use these tools. I think that's critical. And I mean, this is not just relevant for us. It's really for almost any AI tool these days, is you as a user have to understand like the limitation, because otherwise, like, can you use it? Yes. Should you use it exclusively? Like, probably not. And so I think that's, a key kind of takeaway with automation in general.
I like how you're approaching it, though. It's almost like an extra team member or a way to automate some of the stuff that gets in the way of what you need to learn, but you're not necessarily advocating it replace critical thinking or, you automate everything to the extent where you're just making decisions based on what the AI spits out. So, but I like how you're going after one of the harder parts of the process that causes churn or causes some headaches for people trying to do the discovery and validation work. So I think that's a very smart approach. So we covered everything in this interview. So we started with like civil engineering, which I didn't necessarily think we were going to dive in on, but I love the parallel between that and product management. We went through your time through TTT and through Amazon and how some of that influenced your thinking to the point where you wanted to create your own thing with Perceptional and how you tested Perceptional. Such an amazing journey. And I think there's so much more that you're going to test and learn even after this session goes live. If people want to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to get in contact with you?
For sure. Yeah. The best way to find me is probably LinkedIn. So it's just, if you search my name, easy to find there. And then if you want to check out Perceptional, our website is perception.al. So the whole name is kind of in the URL there. So perception.al. But yeah, if you want to reach out to me directly, LinkedIn is the easiest way. Have a pretty unique name, so tend to be pretty easy to find.
So if any listeners are struggling with your surveys and getting one-word answers, or you want to start automating some of the more mundane parts of your discovery and validation, then definitely check out Perceptional. Amer, I just want to thank you so much for being transparent with us and sharing your story and how you're testing things. And thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me, David. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to another episode of How I Tested That, where we share stories about experimentation, tips, and tricks. If you learned something new, please recommend us to a friend or colleague. And remember, keep testing your ideas.